morning, everybody. My name is Dave.
I'm Kirsten.
And together, we're archiving sites.
Woo!
So just to get started, so the background for this presentation is basically Kirsten came to me one day and she said, of course, we're under a deadline. And then she said, we have an existing Drupal site and we need to basically take that offline and make it a static site. I must confess I'm not much of a Drupal person, so I said, okay, we can probably do that. That's fine. I don't know a lot about Drupal. And to be honest, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about in here is not really Drupal specific anyway, so you could really use it with any CMS that you want to archive, any environment. The specifics will differ, but the generalities will be the same for all of them. One thing that struck me after examining Kirsten's site for a few minutes is that it had a lot of pages in it. Boy, howdy did it have a lot of pages in it. So I kind of figured up front, oh, well, this will probably take about, a few minutes or whatever. And it turned out it took a lot longer because the site was so darn big that any time you needed to kind of recalculate how you did things, you had to basically start the process from scratch and then start everything all over again.
We have multiple scrapes of the site. I mean, when I say multiple, I've got like 20 myself, and I think Dave did 5 or 6 as well.
And each one of them was large enough and it took long enough that it would basically run for like 36 hours and take up, I had an external hard drive that I basically just used for that.
What's the magnitude of the number of pages?
It was more than 8,000 nodes, minimum.
Well, I don't know about nodes, but I got a lot more URLs out of it than 8,000.
So
and part of that we'll talk about when we get.
So what I can say is that it was almost 12 years worth of data because they'd never archived it.
Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands. I think so. When we first started doing when I was first asked to do this project, I looked into using GitHub Pages, and they have a limit of 5,000 gigs, I think it is. We exceeded that by an order of magnitude. There was no way we could do that. So that wasn't even an option.
And there was a lot. It was very content rich. There was a lot of pictures and videos, and it was very interesting. Actually, I spent a while looking at it. I was, a lot of interesting stuff in there that is no longer there, but it's moved somewhere else. The title of this is All Good Things Must Come to an End, and the idea is that when we build dynamic sites, they have a limited lifetime. No matter what you're building, who you're building it for, it is going to have a limited lifetime. And figuring out how to handle it at the end of its life might be something worth doing earlier on in the project as well. But we did this, of course, at the very end. There was no thought to doing it, and then there was a thought, and then we did it.
We should probably introduce ourselves.
Oh, I thought didn't I? So I'm Dave Watts.
I think that's the next slide.
I'm very forgetful nowadays, so I'll go directly to the slides. This is Kirsten Burgard, and she was the client for this engagement. And I'm Dave Watts, and I work at a company called Fig Leaf Software. And apparently, we're a big Drupal company. Who knew? Again, I don't do any of the Drupal stuff myself. But I do systems administration and that sort of stuff, so that was a good fit for me to get into this. So I've been, I don't know if you want to say anything else about yourself. I mean, everybody seems to know you already.
Everybody seems to know me already.
Yeah, so Kirsten has the backstage pass and everything like that. Nobody knows me, so I've been working in the field of web development now for about 20 some odd years. Some of those have been odder than others. And I started out working with Cold Fusion many years ago as a developer. We currently do Cold Fusion, but we also do a lot of Drupal work. We do a lot of Drupal work for the federal government. And we also do some state and local governments and schools in
And
Drupal
lots of
as well.
training.
And lots of training. We do offer training, although I don't do that, fortunately.
By the way, the next slide has a lot of that on it.
Yeah, you should be giving this. I should be. I don't
reminding
remember
you.
any of that. So we have a bunch of stuff here about all of our customers. That, you know, rah rah. We're really great, and I think we are pretty good. We have a bunch of happy customers. So we have basically two big primary federal Drupal contracts. We work with the Department of Interior. And they have tons and tons. So they have their own site, but they also have tons and tons of agencies. So we work with their Office of the Inspector General, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, Bureau of Land Management, a whole bunch of them. And then we also do Export-Import Bank of the United States. That's the agency, you've probably heard of it. Every time someone gets elected, they threaten to cancel its authorization, and then they change their mind. So that has been a process going on now for about 20 years. And we're also an Amazon partner. So we've been working with Amazon Web Services now for quite some time. We also do a little work with Microsoft Azure. We are actually running a Drupal site on Microsoft Azure. Don't ask me why. That's actually another federal contract. I think the agency decided they were going to use Azure for everything, and then they decided they were going to build a Drupal site. Drupal and Azure, you know, don't really mix that well, but we're making it work.
It's not pleasant, but you're making it work.
We're making it work, that's right. Amazon is a much more, you know, much more open platform for, you know, if you want to run your own infrastructure and use Drupal. So we found that we can use Amazon in general, beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, to basically meet the same functionality that platforms like Acquia and what's the other, Pantheon offer. And we can do it at a lot less money because we're actually doing the management. So, so I like that. That's a good thing. Oh, and we provide Drupal consulting and training. And you can go to our site, which oddly enough is not in Drupal. It's in WordPress. We're changing that, but anyway, you can learn all about us, and you can take Drupal training, and we do provide consulting and all kinds of stuff like that. So what we're going to talk about today, first of all, why the heck would you actually even want to do this? I mean, if you have a Drupal site and it's working, you know, it might not cost that much to operate it. You could keep it running indefinitely and just never worry about it. Once you've decided you do want to make this trip, there are some things you're going to need to do in Drupal or to your Drupal environment to prepare it, because after all, what you're going to end up with is not dynamic, right? So right now, you probably have things like forms that can accept data, you have logins, you have all kinds of other stuff that might come from dynamic sources and be shown to users. That's all going to go away. That's not going to really exist anymore. So we're going to have to figure that out. We're also going to have to figure out some common quirks that practically every content management system has, such as how URLs are generated. So in a dynamic system, a lot of times URLs are generated in a way to enforce their dynamic nature, right? So that two people don't actually get the same thing. Well, we want everybody to get the same thing, so we're going to have to break that. And then we'll talk about the long and potentially painful process of actually getting the content off of your site. There are some Drupal modules out there that are supposed to do this for you, Based on my examination, they didn't really do so well. So we went with a more traditional approach, which is basically just using a web client to get all of that content. As you can imagine, that's going to be slow and painful in a lot of cases if you have a lot of content. Again, we're going to talk about why you'd want to put it specifically in Amazon S3. So Kirsten mentioned GitHub Page as an alternative, and that might be a suitable alternative as well. But Amazon S3, frankly, has some really good aspects as far as pricing and the things you can do with it that make it a good fit for the static remnants of your site. We'll have to set up S3 to actually do this properly. And then finally, we have to get the content that we've pulled down. We'll have to get that content into S3. You're not going to be able to pull the content directly from Drupal into S3, and you wouldn't want to if you could. We'll explain why that is later. So, what are the indicators for switching? Well, in our case, Kirsten has that.
This is all me. So, we have a requirement in government to transfer all of our data to the archives. So that means you have to actually have your data in a way the archives can use. That's why we needed to do something with static HTML. Normally, they require us to put it on a CD. And did I mention how many gigabytes we had? I was never going to get it on a CD. This is not going to happen. So the reason we went with static HTML was because then we could actually transport it to the archives. And that's all done now. Yay me. Additionally, I needed to make sure that I was not maintaining it, that I already have a full-time job and I don't need this as a side full-time job. It was also written in Drupal 6. Most of it had been ported to 7. There were still things that were just like wrong with the site, and there was not, at that point I was not going to fix it. So we needed to take what we had and do something else with it. And that's why we went with the static. Additionally, because of all of those issues, it was clearly not secure. And that takes us to computational costs. Oops, went too far. So all of these additional costs were associated with us having to maintain this site that we were never going to use again. Well, I'm going to do it. We don't have the option of having an entire other Acquia instance to make this work, because that's what we use. We even tried that route. And when I got the price tag, I was like, this is not going to happen, and I'm still not going to maintain it. And then that takes us back to the maintenance costs, which I was getting rid of. From our servers to our databases to the entire infrastructure, and then on top of it, all of those extra security costs. I wanted none of this. We were talking at about, on a yearly basis, about $70,000 for a site we were never going to use the content for again. So I had to do all kinds of stuff to get rid of all of that dynamic content. I used a module that turned off all the forms. So everything got turned off. Then I went through all of the views to make sure that I turned off all of the AJAX requests. Then I went back through and removed all the modules related to search. And then I went through and made sure I turned off all the feeds. And I still missed stuff. I did not get everything, which we found as we went and did our scrapes. And this is where I'm going to turn it back over to Dave.
Okay. So actually, I'm curious. So what are we paying now for the S3 bucket?
Actually, it's free because of our tier.
Okay.
There's no cost for it.
Free is good.
Free was really good for us.
Yeah, that's a good price. In general, S3 is going to be the cheapest way that you can host stuff. In Amazon anyway, it's going to be the cheapest way you can host stuff. It is again completely static and very, very, very inexpensive. So when Kirsten called me up, again, I'm not much of a Drupal guy, so I didn't know too much about the internals of Drupal. I knew there were things that would need to be turned off. But from my perspective, looking at any kind of dynamic content, when you fetch dynamic content with a crawler, any kind of client, any kind of like a browser or anything else, you know, you have to send a bunch of request headers, and you're going to get back a response. The response gets rendered if it's a browser, or stored if you're using some other kind of crawler. Now, this is actually something that for me has been a problem for many years because I do a lot of work with search. So I've done a lot of work with Google Search Appliance, and that acts like a crawler. And so one problem that you can have with the Google Search Appliance is it follows links. And basically, any kind of crawler is going to follow links. They might come from the sitemap, or they might be derived just from identifying what links are in a page, and then followed and followed and followed, and so on and so forth. But one problem with crawlers generally is that a lot of times there's stuff in a dynamic site specifically to prevent user agents from getting the same result at the same time, or something along those lines, something to enforce the dynamic nature of the site. In Drupal, images are served with a URL parameter called itok. And so what this meant for us is that you know, you might have the same 10 images, but there might be 100 links to those images, and they have different itok parameters, and they're all unique. And the client doesn't really have a way to know, okay, well, you know, they're all the same image, so I'm going to store it without that URL parameter, and I'm going to rewrite all the links to point to that one image. So that's a very common problem with crawlers. And again, you know, I've worked with the Google Search Appliance a lot. That has a very simple crawling mechanism in it. Here we were working with wget and curl, and then another one which we actually ended up using, whose name escapes me. So I'll figure that out in a minute. Another problem, and again, this isn't really necessarily specific to Drupal, is that most CMSs have a way to present friendly URLs to people. So instead of having this really complex URL that people are not going to remember, you're able to present an alias of some sort. And in Drupal, we have node links, which, you know, basically seem to fit the bill for that. So you might have you know, a node link, and you might also end up having the actual link, and then you end up duplicating the content if, you know, those aren't kind of consistent, if you're not using just one or the other. So what Kirsten did, she did all the Drupal stuff basically. She went in and she made sure that you know, anything where an end user could normally interact was turned off. And not only did it have to be turned off, but it had to be clear that it was not, you know, that it wasn't going to work. So you don't want to present a form, you know, in your static content and then have the user fill it out and then find out, oh, it doesn't do anything. So basically all of those embedded forms were turned off. So Kirsten used this disable all forms module, which does what it says on the tin. Any modules that add dynamic content. So if you have something, for example, building RSS feeds based on you know, internal parameters, you know, that obviously is going to stop working. So we went through, I took a look at this, and Kirsten took a deeper look at it to identify those modules. Now the thing is, if you have a large enough and old enough site, there's probably going to be something that you miss. So frankly, one of the other things that we want to do that I don't think is actually listed on the slide is actually provide some notification on the site.
Oh, yeah, it is.
So now on the archived site, when you go there,
keep going. We'll go back to this one.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I just got off an airplane, so I'm kind of
He got in late last night.
Yeah.
There we go.
So yeah, if you go to the archive site, which has the odd name dip note, there's a reason for that. It's a government acronym, but it just struck me as kind of funny. Anyway, there's a notification at the top that basically says, hey, look, this is all archive content. You know, it's not going to actually do anything. You can look at it, but it's not going to do anything. So that's kind of just a manual change that we would recommend making. So anything, again, that is going to allow the system to generate dynamic content or allow users to input dynamic content, all that stuff has to be turned off. So things like commenting, things like RSS feed builders that that are going to build using internal parameters, disabling views using Ajax, because again, there's not going to be any database to pull that information from.
External links to like whitehouse.gov or state.gov, because those no longer are valid. I mean, those are technically still valid sites, but we're going archive to archive, so I can't transfer those things over too.
Yeah, and again, just kind of going back to the way we started the presentation, everything that we build for the web is ephemeral. It has a lifespan. It's all going to die, right? So I know as web developers, that's not really what you'll want to hear, right? You don't want to hear, well, this project that you're working on 3 years from now is going to be in the dustbin. It's going to be replaced by a completely different project because budget was there and new technology is there and so on and so forth. So when you're building an archive, to make that archive self-contained, you really can't have links to live things in the world because they're live now, but they're not going to be live later. And this especially goes to specific content pages, right? So if you had a link to whitehouse.gov, well, chances are there will be a website at whitehouse.gov in the future. Let's just wait and see about that. But I'm hoping that keeps going. But if you link to a specific page on whitehouse.gov that was put there, back in, I was going to say the Carter administration, but they didn't have websites back then. But back in the day, that content gets deleted and churned and refreshed on a constant basis for a variety of good reasons. So you can't really expect those links to work in the future. Now, the specific problem that I ran into, again, with the images, there is a URL parameter called ITOK, which it basically is to keep it from pulling from a client's cache or pulling from some other cache that's not supposed to pull from. And in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, you can control this by editing settings.php. It's pretty simple and it's well documented. So basically, you just have to suppress the output of ITOK. You need to identify the list of nodes, and there are a bunch of tools out there that will let you do that. And you do have some options on the S3 side for handling rewrites. We really didn't do too much of this because we were kind of under the gun, and we were doing this like on weekends and in between.
And on the 4th of July.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is a good way to celebrate, I think, the country is by archiving a State Department website. I mean, how much less...
See how that works?
That's pretty patriotic, right?
Pretty patriotic.
So
and it was a web scrape, so it was running in the background anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's most of the time, yeah. So it is possible on S3 to do rewrites. So if you can, in advance, kind of identify all the things that need to be rewritten, then you can handle that. You can basically build rewrites, on S3. It doesn't really support all the full mod rewrite syntax, but for a lot of things you're doing in Drupal, it's probably sufficient.
And on a smaller site than the size that we had, it would have been probably a lot easier.
Yeah, I mean, part of this was, we kind of rushed into this because, we had a deadline. If you had a little more time to prepare for this, then that's something that, could have been planned out, and we could have approached it a little differently. So again, providing some, user notification that something is going on, I think is a very important part of this process. From the user's perspective, it's very hard to tell a dynamic site from a static site or archive content from live content. So you have to kind of explicitly tell the user that. Okay, now here's the part that for us was really the difficult part. Well, first of all, Kirsten's using OS X and I'm using Windows. So right there, we didn't get along. But they have a lot of common tools on both of them that you can use. But the problem that we faced was actually, there were kind of multiple aspects to it. And I don't think this slide really gets to all of them.
That's okay. We have 15 minutes, so we're good.
Yeah. I mean, the problem that we have is that we need to fetch all of the content, but we need to not fetch duplicate content with different URLs that go to the same thing. And we need to rewrite the URLs in the content so that they actually point to the static version of the dynamic file. So if you think about that, in Drupal, you have some control that's going to let you display images, right? So here we have, I guess what they call a hero banner. That's still the terminology,
still
right?
Hero.
A hero banner. It's got, from a user's perspective, or rather a content contributor's perspective, the content contributor basically plugs a bunch of stuff into that, and they don't really have to worry about the underlying aspects. And then when that's actually served to a user, there's stuff in there to make sure that they're getting today's hero banner versus the one from last week, and that it automatically navigates to the next picture and blah, blah, blah. And so you might have a picture, and that picture might actually have many different URL endpoints assigned to it. And none of those might be useful for a static file. So static files are things like myfile.jpg or myimage.png. You really can't use URL parameters, right? So if everything has a URL parameter, you have to find a way to basically prevent as many of those from being served by Drupal as possible. But also, when you fetch the content, if you have a link directly to any of those URLs that have parameters, you need your tool, whatever you're using to download the content, or some other tool after the fact, you need to rewrite all that content. So you're actually downloading each HTML page, and you're rewriting each HTML page. And that, as you can imagine, doing both of those at the same time, that can be a little problematic. And that was really, at that point, that's when Kirsten called me and said, hey, I'm having problems because I've got this thing that takes 3 days to do, and it isn't working for me, and I'm running out of 3-day periods in which to do it. At that point, we're crawling the site. On OS X and on Windows, you have a variety of tools. I left curl out of these for some reason. I don't know why, but curl is available on both platforms. Curl and wget aren't built into Windows, but you can download them if you want.
I also tried SiteSucker.
SiteSucker?
So I tried all 3 of those, and each one did something slightly differently. The easiest one I found was actually HTTrack.
Yeah, and part of this, again, remember, is because it's doing both of these operations. So you have to put in parameters for the site crawl, but you also have to put in parameters to control the rewrite of the site. And so I started out with wget just really because that's the tool that I use the most. And I ended up having enough problems getting both the download and the rewrite to work properly that I ended up switching to WinHTTrack, frankly, because it was just easier to plug the parameters in. It was
Because
very
you could do
easy
it all
to
on
do
the
that.
command line, as opposed to wget, which we were using mostly with the UI.
Well, for me, I was using wget on the command line, and I used WinHTTrack on the UI.
I used HTTrack on the command line and wget on a UI. That's pretty funny.
Now, another problem that you might run into, as you know, today's life of digital nomads, is that if you're going to actually sit down and download a site, you might not have a full contiguous 36-hour period to do that. Right? So I can't really do that with my laptop if I'm flying somewhere and giving a presentation on something. So you need to have some way to pause and resume. And in my experience, wget, while it does give you some functionality for doing that, it usually doesn't work out that well. So that's just my own personal experience. Another thing that we have on websites specifically to deal with crawlers like wget and other user agents that other than browsers is the file robots.txt. And robots.txt, of course, says, hey, don't go to all these directories. Well, we got to go to all these directories. So you have to have a way to tell whatever download tool you're using to ignore robots.txt. And frankly, you probably want to take a look at robots.txt because it gives you a good guide to things that you will probably need, even though it tells you you don't need them. It gives you a good idea of stuff on the site that you don't want crawlers to get to. In this case, we do want crawlers to get to it.
We've got 10 minutes left, so
okay.
Probably need to move them on.
You need to download all the assets for your site, so HTML, CSS, JS, images, whatever else is used on the client. You also have to make sure you're downloading only files from your site. It's bad enough we're downloading multiple gigs of stuff from the State Department. If we end up following a link accidentally that goes to a third-party site, then you can be in a never-ending path of pain and suffering.
We did that a couple of times.
Yeah. And also, when you're downloading these files and rewriting them, if those files have hard-coded, fully qualified domain names in them, chances are that FQDN is going to be different on your new location. So ideally, you want to strip those out and make them relative to the site root. So this, I apologize for the screenshot, but this basically shows what for me was the winning bunch of settings in WinHTTrack, and you can see this is attempt number 2 for me. So basically, to actually rewrite the content, I use this string of parameters, and if anyone wants a screenshot, I can give it to you in a more readable format. But that was really the key for me, was getting that exactly right, and there was a little bit of experimentation involved in that. Oh, that's a little more readable as well. But again, this is available for anybody who wants to take a look at it. We will need to accept cookies. We will need to, when they say parse Java files, what we actually mean is JavaScript. It's just, Now, you may find that your first fetch attempt didn't actually get everything you wanted to do.
Or your 20th.
Or your 20th. Wah, wah, wah. So there are a bunch of command line tools, especially in the Unix world, that will let you rewrite your content. So remember, we're trying to fetch and rewrite all at once. If the rewrite fails, you don't necessarily have to throw the fetch away, but you can use tools like sed and that sort of stuff on the command line. On the Windows side of things, you can use PowerShell. And PowerShell has a very powerful, shell. Lets you...
Yes, I did actually write that. Don't be me.
So figuring out where you're actually going to put these files also is important, because you don't want them mixed up with other files, and that's very easy to do.
Because then you accidentally recopy those files that you've already put in. That actually happened to me twice. So yes, please make sure you're in the right folder.
Okay, so that allows us to get the content. Now, what I don't have, I need to add a slide for this right afterwards. What I don't have is, obviously, at this point, you're going to test. You're going to test your stuff, and it's going to be on your local machine. All you need to do really is, at this point, you should be able to browse to it on the file system. You shouldn't even need to go via HTTP. But if you want, you can set up an Apache server, and then, again, just kind of make that the doc root for the server, and make sure you can get to everything. It should work fine with localhost. If it doesn't work fine with localhost, that indicates some of your rewrite stuff didn't work properly. You can use your own host file to create the name that it should work at, and then test it again, and all of these are becoming less and less optimal. Okay, so you've done your testing, and now you're ready to actually move it to somewhere else. And again, our suggestion for this is S3, Amazon Simple Storage System. It's made for storing stuff, and what I like about it is that it has a very high tolerance for failure, and I don't have to manage any servers. Those two things are like magic to me. I work with AWS a lot. I have to manage a lot of servers, and while AWS makes it easier to manage servers, I still want to do less of that, right? So having this serverless configuration, there's a lot of value there. AWS S3 has a very high failure tolerance. It's basically region-wide. So if you're familiar with how AWS is organized, you have areas of the country, which are regions, and each region will have multiple availability zones in it. Each availability zone is one or more data centers. So a region-wide failure, basically there are two possible causes for that. One is that somebody at Amazon does something really, really dumb, and then, it'll come back online shortly after that. Like they had a router problem a few years ago. And another is, catastrophe, like a giant meteor, in which case I don't care about the website anymore. So in S3, we have this structure called a bucket. A bucket is basically just a container of data. You can create subfolders and whatnot in the bucket, but the bucket is kind of the smallest atomic unit of data in S3. S3 buckets have no fixed size, so you can have a bucket that has tons and tons of stuff in it. That's not a problem. Buckets are used for assigning permissions and doing configuration to make it actually serve as a website. Now, I mentioned that you can have subfolders in S3, but I lied. You really can't. We can make documents in S3 that look like they have subfolders, but there actually are no subfolders. So the subfolder name, so to speak, actually becomes part of the document name. For our purposes, that's fine. It looks like a regular, website path. But again, there's really no folder structure in S3. S3, all interactions to S3 are via HTTPS. By default, to manage S3, all that stuff, that all happens via HTTPS. There's no native file system for S3. So it's not like you can map a drive and then copy stuff. There are tools that provide the illusion of being able to do that, but again, they're really just using HTTPS to get and put files. I talked a little bit about Amazon Web Services location stuff. Again, we have regions in the United States and across the world. Each region is an area of the country. There is actually one region specifically designed for the U.S. government called GovCloud, and GovCloud does support S3. But you don't have to use GovCloud even if you have to meet specific requirements for your content. All the commercial regions actually meet the same security standards and all that stuff that GovCloud does. So you can use, we have many government agencies using US East. GovCloud is actually on the West Coast. I don't know why, but there it is. Now, if you do want to provide something that will survive even the giant meteor, you can set up something called cross-region replication. So at that point, contents from one S3 bucket can be synchronized with another S3 bucket. The cost for that is actually fairly low, but honestly, unless you really have very stringent requirements that this be available to everybody in the world all the time, you probably don't need that. Now, to actually manage anything in AWS, you have to log into an AWS console or command line or whatever you want to use. They have different levels of accounts. We recommend that you set up what is called an IAM account. IAM accounts can have all kinds of limitations placed on them. There is a root account by default. We recommend that you only use the root account long enough to create the IAM accounts that you need, and then you give the root account some really insanely long password. You never use it again, and you check your audit trail for any logins to the root account. There won't be any. IAM supports multi-factor authentication, so you can hook it up to your cell phone when you want to log into the console. I recommend you do that. Now, S3 by default is just a storage location. It's not a website right out of the box. There is an option when you set up an S3 bucket. There's basically a checkbox that says, I want to use this as a website. Check that box. That's basically all there is to set that up. But you don't really have a web server. You don't have Apache or Nginx or IIS or anything like that with all the different configuration options. Very minimal configuration. There is support for showing error pages, which you should set up. And there is support for redirects, which again is a lot simpler than what you have, with mod rewrite, but it's probably good enough now that your site is dynamic anyway. Now, if you want to keep access logs, you actually have to set up a separate S3 bucket for that. So your site is in one bucket, and then it logs to another bucket. Now, all of this is actually very simple to do, and if you go to this web page and do it, it'll take you about 10 minutes. The hardest part is you have to find a credit card and put that in to pay for this. But once you're done with that, everything else is very easy. Now, every S3 bucket has a DNS entry that belongs to Amazon. So it'll be something like your bucket name dot S3 AWS region, so like US East 1 dot AmazonAWS.com. You don't really have any control over that because obviously all this infrastructure belongs to Amazon. So if you want to point www.figleaf.com at this, what you'll have to do in your DNS is create a CNAME. So the CNAME will resolve to whatever the full bucket name is. That's an easy thing for a DNS administrator to do. Now, what is not so easy is support for HTTPS. S3 has HTTPS already, and the certificate name that it's using belongs to Amazon because it's their stuff, right? So if you want people to go to HTTPS, www.yoursite.com, well, that's going to be kind of a problem because there's no place for you to put that certificate in S3. At this point, things get a little more complicated. Amazon offers a second service called CloudFront. CloudFront is normally used as a CDN. So the way you might use Varnish in Drupal to cache content, well, a CDN is simply kind of a global cache, a global edge cache. You've probably heard of Akamai. CloudFront is just Amazon's version of Akamai, basically. Now, one of the things that CloudFront has is the ability for you to upload your own certificates. So we're actually not really interested in the CDN portion of this. What we're interested in is just the ability to use HTTPS. And this is actually going to make this a little more expensive. Using CloudFront, the CloudFront cost is probably going to be higher than your S3 cost. But it's still going to be cheaper than hosting the whole thing in Acquia by a long shot. Now, one other problem, which I actually ran into recently, are zone apex records. Now, zone apex record in DNS is what a lot of developers will call a root domain. So, for example, figleaf.com instead of www.figleaf.com. I remember in the old days where no one would use their zone apex record for a website. Nowadays, kids these days, they're doing all kinds of stuff. But if you have content that is at your zone apex, you can't use a CNAME record for your zone apex. So you have to use an A record, and the A record will actually have to point to the IP address of your S3 bucket. So this isn't really legal in the DNS world. You should never create an A record that points to the IP address for which there's already an A record somewhere else. You're not supposed to do that. But it does actually work. So you can find out the IP address for whatever your bucket name is, and then you can plug that in as your zone apex record. Now, if you're using Amazon for a variety of services, you have another approach. They have a DNS service called Route 53. I really highly recommend that. Does anyone in here manage DNS? You do? This is fantastic. Whatever you're using today, you should drop it and you should switch to Route 53. It's really good. It's very inexpensive as well. One of the nice things about Route 53 is that it has a way to handle that zone apex record. They have kind of a custom record that they call a name that allows them to point to a name, but it's still a valid zone. I don't know how that works. It's magic, but it works. Route 53 is just good in general. I wouldn't recommend it just for that, but it's really good. Now, ideally, you shouldn't serve content from your zone apex. You should redirect to a fully qualified host and domain name if you can. It just makes things a little easier. Both Amazon S3 and CloudFront support IPv4 and IPv6. So that's becoming a government requirement now. So you can handle that.
We're actually overtime now? So.
We're overtime, so I'm just going to run through some stuff real quick. We're almost at the very end here.
About like 2 more minutes.
So to get your files into S3, there are a variety of mechanisms to let you upload your files. You can actually do it directly from the AWS the console, the web console, but I wouldn't recommend that for any large number of files. That's going to stall out and fail. There are a lot of clients that you can use. On Windows, there's a really terrible client called CyberDuck. It's terrible, but it's good enough. So this is not the kind of thing you're probably going to be doing every day. You're just doing it once. You can download it. It's free, but it really does suck.
It really sucks. And you get pop-up ads occasionally. Really annoying.
Well, if it runs that long.
Unfortunately, it had to run that long.
I mean, yeah, you have to actually have it run successfully that long before you can get an ad. So that's a good thing. On OS X, what we use in our office, what our designers use, is Panic, and I think that costs about 30 or 40 bucks. But they use it all the time because we use S3 for our mock-ups and things like that. So they use Panic Transmit, and they're very happy with that. But again, it's not free. Another option is to actually use the AWS Command-Line Interface. You can actually use this for pretty much anything you want to do in AWS. So if you're working with AWS a lot, you want to familiarize yourself with that. It lets you log in from the command line, and then you can basically call the AWS command with a bunch of arguments and have it do a bunch of things. And you can incorporate this into shell scripts. And they also have a plug-in for PowerShell, which is also very nice. So if you're a PowerShell guy like me, well, I'm learning to be a PowerShell guy, that's very handy. Then you can do all that stuff from the command line. Now, to actually log in using AWS CLI or the PowerShell thing, you're going to need, instead of your username and your password and your soft token, you're going to need something called your access key, your access ID, and your private access key. When you create an IAM account, you'll have the option to pull those out. You will want to pull them out so that you can use them later. Only IAM accounts have that. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our presentation. If you have any questions about this, you can send emails to me or
me.
Either one of us. Send us emails. If there are things about AWS configuration, you'd probably be better off sending them to me.
Yes.
And if they're about
how to fail up, you can send them to me.
Or just the Drupal aspects of this, because Kirsten was able to go in and set that stuff up. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
And good luck getting rid of the stuff that's dead.